Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University, and it is my great privilege to welcome you to a special SFS alumni event, What's Next for Ukraine and Russia. Let me start by welcoming you here. We're going to have about a 35 minute conversation with two of our best SFS faculty. I'm sure you have seen them across the news channels and various other media events over these last days, because not surprisingly, when an event of this magnitude occurs, it's SFS faculty members who are really on the front lines of engaging and helping us understand these events. And I'm deeply privileged to have two of our best faculty members with me here today. We have Professor Angela Stent, recently retired. I guess she was hoping to get some quiet time as a retiree, but that certainly hasn't happened. Professor Angela Stent, who has been the director of our Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, but is really, I think, the leading voice in understanding Soviet and post-Soviet foreign policy and the foreign policy of Russia and the former states of the Soviet Union. It's wonderful to have her here. And I hope you know also that in addition to her role as a respected scholar in this area, she's also been a high-level practitioner, having served in the as a national intelligence officer for Russia and in the State Department. So it's wonderful to have her here. We also have Professor Charlie Kupchan, who has been a long-standing senior member of the SFS faculty. He has also been senior director for Europe under President Obama. It's great to have them here looking at the situation from the lens of Europe, from the lens of Russia and Eastern Europe, and I'm happy to moderate the discussion. Let me sort of say for myself that I started my own career as a Sovietologist. Dates me, certainly, in terms of my age and experience, but I began with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And over the last 40 years, have been working on what we thought was a transition to democracy and market economies in the countries of the former Soviet Union, and which recent events have shown how problematic much of our thinking has been. So let me sort of start this conversation, and then, as I said, we will open it up for question and answers through the question and answer function. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go forward. But look, let me start with getting from you a sense of the impact of the current moment. Of course, we've seen Russia unprovoked invade a sovereign nation, begin an unprecedented land war in Europe, which now looks like it will have thousands, if not more, of casualties. But of course, the deeper and greater concern is the impact that it's have on the entire global order. Are we is this the end of the post-Cold War era? Can we sort of say that that post-Cold War era ended with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And do we really think now that we are on the cusp of a complete reordering of the global security and diplomatic landscape? Let me start with Professor Stent. Angela.
Thank you, Joel, and I'm delighted to be on this call with all these alumni. I think we are at the end of the post-Cold War order. I think Vladimir Putin certainly hopes that we are. We had hoped for the past 30 years that Russia would want to become more integrated into the global economy, into kind of the global system. That we, I think, believed at one point that also admitting it to things like the G7, which became the G8 and now is the G7 again after Crimea, to the World Trade Organization, that we could slowly sort of work with Russia to integrate it into these global structures. And increasingly, Putin has looked out. He has decided that the world order as it emerged after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union is one that was fashioned by the US and its allies, that Russia really didn't have any agency in that it didn't cater to Russia's interests. He's determined to restore Russia as a great power with a sphere of influence, by the way, which is not only in the post-Soviet space, but clearly extends beyond that to Central and Eastern Europe, as we can see from the demands that were made in these two treaties that were presented to the United States and NATO in December of last year. He wants to relitigate the end of the Cold War. And I think what he really wants in his mind, the kind of post-West order that he talks about, is a disruptive world order. It's a Hobbesian world order. It's a world order without rules. So it's no longer just, he talks a lot about the Yalta system, where you would have now three great powers with three spheres of influence, including China, but where there would be rules, because there were rules during the Cold War. I think his goal is much more disruptive. And that's why I think this is a very dangerous moment. And we really don't know how it's going to develop going forward, but it really means that in many ways, the United States and its allies will have to go back in a way to the kind of policies they pursued during the Cold War and understand that the containment of Russia is now very much at the forefront of our security needs.
Let me go over to Charlie on this same question.
I basically agree with Angela. I think when we kind of look back over these few decades, we'll see three geopolitical turning points: the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, and February 24, 2022. And I think that if Putin is ambitious enough and reckless enough to invade and try to pacify and subjugate Ukraine, we have to take seriously the prospect that he has other intentions. And Angela mentioned the documents that the Russians have laid out as the diplomacy over Ukraine unfolded, and they are not, shall we say, small bore. They want to reverse the post-Cold War settlement. Does that mean that Putin is about to make a play for Kaliningrad and the Baltics, that he's going to widen the war to Poland? I doubt it, because he knows that that would trigger Article 5, the NATO defense guarantee. But I do think that we are going back to something resembling containment. And I was, until last week, someone who believed we were moving into a complicated and bumpy world, but one that would remain globalized and interdependent. I never really thought that decoupling was an option, because we're all in this boat together. I think we're witnessing decoupling from Russia. It's going to get worse. I think the sanctions will deepen. It's conceivable to me that Putin could turn off the flow of gas to Europe. That will escalate the situation. A big question in my mind, Joel, is what is China going to do? Is China going to stand by Russia? If so, will we hit them with secondary sanctions? Then we do really see, I think, a more extensive decoupling. The one caveat I would offer before stopping is that it's not inconceivable to me that this is the beginning of the end of Putin, because he really just took a big bite. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult to digest Ukraine. Ordinary Russians are going to feel the pain. There's more grumbling and discomfort among the Russian populace and Russian elites, I would point out, than I think many of us expected. It's not inconceivable to me that those around Putin could eventually say, this isn't working. I don't predict that. I'm not saying it's likely, but if that were to happen, then this ends up being more of a blip. But right now, I would say it's a game changer and not a blip.
We're going to get in this conversation into what this means next on containment, on relations with China, on perhaps the next steps in its relations with NATO. But before we do, I'd want to hear from both of you one backward-looking question, which is, if you have to think about one mistake that we made, there were lots of uncertainties, there were lots of historical contingencies that brought here. But thinking, because it's important to think about what we do next, what is one mistake that we made, we meaning the US, the Western nations, in its engagement with Russia, that brought us there, and a lesson that we will have to take with us as we think about responding to the next step? Let me go to Angela with that.
Yeah, so I do think that a mistake was made in April of 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit. Now, before the summit, the Bush administration called up its NATO allies and said, we want to offer Ukraine and Georgia a membership perspective. And this was largely driven by people in the office of the vice president who were fans of Mikhail Saakashvili, the then president of Georgia, and wanted to offer Georgia and then Ukraine this NATO perspective. And the Germans and the French particularly objected to this. And so a compromise was worked out very hastily as the meeting was going on. And the compromise was to say on paper, Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. But there was no plan about how that would happen. Nothing was ever done after that to advance NATO membership for either of those countries. And yet the Russians could look at that and say, look, it says that Ukraine is going to join NATO. And that really, it was the worst of both worlds. It didn't help Ukraine, and it gave Putin, an excuse to keep hammering the West with it. Now, having said that, I don't think this, Putin hasn't invaded Ukraine because there's some vague promise that in 10 or 20 years' time it might join NATO. But he's very skillfully used this as a piece of propaganda to tell his own country that they're threatened by the possibility of NATO moving closer to Ukraine, and use this as an excuse. And if you look at what some of our colleagues are writing about the war now, partly blaming the West for it. So it's very unfortunate. I think the lesson one has to learn from that is you have to think very carefully before, putting something down on paper like that without being willing to, in fact, implement it, to say, fine, if we then would have started the process of making Ukraine, a possible NATO membership, it's a long process, that would have been one thing, but we've kind of left it hanging out there. So I do not believe that NATO enlargement was a mistake, unlike some of my colleagues in other universities. But I do believe that was a mistake in the year 2008, given what we knew about Putin, and given the fact that that acted as an incentive to invade Georgia. Of course, at that point, this was a more cautious Putin, and they only took these two entities, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and they didn't attack Tbilisi, which they could have. Now we have a very different Putin. But I think that is one of the issues that has led us to where we are now.
Before I go to Charlie, I want to just ask a follow-up on Putin, because first of all, have been one of the most prominent observers of Putin. You've met him and engaged with him over the years. You talked about a more cautious Putin, a different Putin at the moment in which that agreement and the uncertainties about that agreement were made. But you also mentioned that there was a change. There has been a change in Putin. I mean, give us a little bit of your sense of the, of essentially what the nature of that change is, and is it something that one hears now is a rapid kind of change in his demeanor, in his approach, and perhaps his understanding and isolation associated with COVID? Has this been a short-term kind of change in Putin as an individual, or has this been a gradual sort of shift as he became more and more, if you will, angered about injustices that he foresaw in these arrangements?
So Putin's grievances have been very consistent, and they've been on display since his speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, when he accused the United States of trying to dominate the world and threaten Russia. Those grievances have been there, but he acted as a more, rational, aggressive actor. Again, in 2008, they could have taken Tbilisi, they didn't. Even in 2014, after they annexed Crimea and they started a war in the Donbass region, they then stopped. They didn't try and take more territory. And in fact, neither of those entities controlled the entirety of the territory they were supposed to. So I have seen a change. And I think most people, you can attribute it to a lot of different things. He looks different today. If you listen to the speeches that he's made in the last couple of weeks, the diatribe against Ukraine that he made, I think, last Monday night, the way he treated his National Security Council, humiliating the head of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and again, the accusations he made about Ukraine and the United States, talking about Nazis in Ukraine and genocide against Russians, really, the rhetoric has become shriller and shriller. And then once the sanctions were imposed a few days ago, saying that he had put his defense and nuclear forces on high alert, we're not quite sure. Special alert. We don't really know what that means. And fortunately, the United States has not responded in kind, but he has now raised the specter of nuclear weapons and of this conflict, even escalating further. It may only be bullying. It may only be to, to throw everyone off guard, but he is not acting like the kind of more pragmatic, risk-averse leader that he was, I think, prior to the last year or two, and certainly to this last year. And it does raise all kinds of speculation about what his mental and physical state is. And then it does raise questions, and Charlie has already raised that. Would this cause some of the people around him, given the escalation that's happening now, to question, whether he should stay in power? He seems to have greatly miscalculated what the cause of the war would look like. Let me just tell the audience here that 2 days after the war began, RIA Novosti, which is a government-controlled media site, put up an article on its website that had clearly been written the day before saying, "We won, the Ukrainians greeted us as liberators, the West is finished, the Anglo-Saxon world is finished." They've since taken the article down, but somehow Putin must have believed that the Ukrainians would greet the Russian soldiers with open arms, and they would want to be liberated from fascism, quote unquote. So his sources of information are obviously faulty. Maybe that's what he wants to believe. So you really have the image of him as someone who is living in a bubble and really quite disconnected from reality.
Okay, Charlie, a mistake and a lesson that we take from it that brought us to where we are.
I agree with Angela, although I would go a little bit further. And people like Angela and I will be debating the pros and cons of NATO enlargement until we're well on the other side of the pearly gates. This keeps us in business. But I do think there were probably some missed opportunities back in the 1990s when the decision to proceed with NATO enlargement was made. Some missed opportunities to try to make Russia a stakeholder in the system rather than an object of the system. But you could also say that because Ukraine is now under Russian attack, it just justifies NATO enlargement because, yes, he's attacking Georgia and Ukraine that are not NATO members, and not NATO members because they have the Article 5 agreement. But I also agree with Angela that this issue ended up being a smokescreen, not the nub of the issue. And that's because, Biden himself said, school's out on NATO enlargement. We're not really taking seriously at this point Ukrainian membership, but we're just leaving the doors open. Macron, the president of France, uttered the word Finlandization, and everyone was shocked and in horror, but he said it. Zelensky himself at times has said, neutrality, maybe NATO membership is a dream. So there was enough trade space for Putin to pick up on this if he wanted to. He didn't want to. And I agree that he's living in a bubble. One other lesson that I would take away is, and this was a kind of negative knock-on effect of the statement that NATO will open its doors to Georgia and Ukraine. It encourages them to get out over their skis. Saakashvili did get too big for his britches. He thought that he had our back, and that led him to go too far. And what happened? The Russians went in. I think the Ukrainians have been much more careful than Saakashvili. They've, for the most part, been pretty level-headed and taken seriously the Minsk process, although it was stalled. But I think one lesson here for the U.S. is don't lead countries to think that we have their back when, in the end of the day, we're not prepared to go to war. And this is especially true of countries that live in the so-called gray zone. That is, countries unfortunate enough to be in the neighborhood of Russia. My final comment would be to echo Angela. I'm surprised. I got it wrong. I think Angela and I were on a CFR event. Was it the day that the war began? It may have even been
the day before.
The day before, and I think I said in that because I believe that I don't think he's going to do it. And I said that largely based on his past behavior. which was aggressive, coercive, repressive, but careful. I took him to be a shrewd tactician who picked his fights carefully. He took small bites. And so I thought, this guy's not going to try to occupy Ukraine. Is he out of his mind? But Angela's right. He seems to be in a different mode. He seems to be acting in some ways out of anger and delusion. And that's scary because it says that he's not calculating rationally. And that's when strange and dangerous things happen. One of the issues that I'm most worried about is a potential Russian strike against arms coming through Poland, which are now flowing into Ukraine, into Western Ukraine. Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. If he does try to interdict arms that are coming to Ukrainians or Ukrainian insurgents, that's an attack on NATO.
Well, I want to follow up on that because that's the next question I really wanted to ask. Because thinking about what comes next is the possibility of further action that go deeper into a challenge to the very structure of NATO and the Article 5 guarantee. Right? Look, it would seem to me that a fundamental issue in driving this whole crisis was from the very start, there was a clear recognition that although we thought that Putin was rational enough not to use military force, he certainly showed his willingness to use it. Amassing 200,000 troops and preparing for an invasion was a demonstration that he was willing to use military force. We made very clear from the very start, Biden was very clear about it, everyone else was, that we were not willing to use military force. We developed sanctions, we had a lot of other threats, but we were not going to use military force. That's a fundamental imbalance that surely weighed upon his thinking. That fundamental imbalance, has it changed? Does it change much when we think about the next layer of potential incursion into NATO, which is, Charlie mentioned before, an attack on the Baltics, or as you say, perhaps even more likely, an attack to prevent further rearming that would impact a NATO member. And if he does take that step, I mean, has that fundamental calculus changed of the West's willingness to put troops on the ground to escalate the crisis militarily as a result? What is the potential next level of risk against NATO, and how should or could NATO respond? Maybe I start with Angela and then ask Charlie to respond. It's a tough one.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with Charlie. By the way, I would just say the panel that we were on actually was the day when the invasion began that night. And both of us, I think, thought that there would be some military action, but it would be limited to the Donbass region. And that's partly because that's what Putin was talking about. We've recognized these two independent entities now, and we're going to help save them. So I think we weren't wrong in thinking that. This was obviously deception. So I do agree with Charlie that the most likely event, or that could get us into a much more difficult place, is if the Russians try and interdict the supplies that are coming into Ukraine from Poland. I mean, since the airspace is really closed, we can't fly those things anymore, so they're largely coming over land. And if there was some, hit where Poland was actually involved in a conflict with Russian troops, then it really would be a dilemma for NATO. We do have Article 5, collective defense. If a NATO member is attacked, then it is the duty of NATO to come to that country's defense, and then we're in a NATO-Russia war. President Biden was very clear, and he keeps repeating it. He repeated it last night in the State of the Union speech, that US soldiers will not be fighting with the Ukrainians, because again, that could escalate into a US-Russian conflict and two nuclear superpowers. One thing that some people are now saying, by the way, is maybe the United States should not have taken off the table completely the use of air power, which would have supported the Ukrainians. But again, that would run the risk, clearly, of some encounter with the Russians. So I do think the likelihood of this, spreading to an Eastern, front NATO member is certainly there. Right now, the Russians seem to be stuck in what's happening in Ukraine. They're bombing indiscriminately, they're killing civilians, and they're advancing on Kiev, but so far they haven't managed to subdue it yet. So in that sense, they're stuck, but that could change. This is a kinetic situation, And if NATO did not respond to an attack on a member, then of course it would be shown to be rather toothless. I should mention that, when Russia attacked Estonia in 2007 and shut down the entire, it was a cyber attack and shut down all the government computers and things like that, NATO did not take any action. So there are distinctions made about, in terms of the NATO response, about what constitutes an attack. But if there were really some conflict between Russian and Polish military, then I think it would be difficult for NATO not to respond.
Charlie, you've spent your career working with the Europeans. Would NATO respond? And to some extent, as Angela was sort of suggesting, knowing that it's going to be extremely unlikely that anyone would be willing to get into a sort of significant NATO-Russia military confrontation, does that even increase the incentive of Putin to try to prick the bubble of NATO's military collective security agreement?
I'm pretty confident that if Putin attacks a NATO country, be it Poland or Estonia, NATO is going to go to war. What form that war would take would depend upon where he moves, how much territory he takes, the nature of the attack. There would be, a cyber component. There would be more sanctions. I don't think that we'd be in World War III immediately, but there would be a military response. And Biden said as much last night: every inch of NATO territory will be defended. I have to say, Joel, that I'm very impressed with, number one, the solidarity that the United States has built, not just with allies in Europe, but with Japan and a wide range of countries. I think the vote in the UN General Assembly today was 145 nations condemning Russia. That's a pretty resounding majority. And we had an event on campus. Was it last Thursday that we did that? If you had told me that by next Wednesday, Germany would have announced 100 billion euros on defense, 2% of GDP on defense, we're going to start sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. The European Commission is now reimbursing countries to send weapons to Ukraine. SWIFT has been removed from a number of Russian banks. The assets of the Russian central bank have been frozen. This is serious business. And I am struck by how quick and how far-reaching the response has been. And I'm pretty bullish about Europe's readiness to toe the line. This has been a wake-up call for Europe. And I think it really comes down to one thing, and I lived through this when I was in the White House. We were trying to impose sanctions with the Europeans. It was like pulling teeth, getting nowhere. And then suddenly MH17 comes down, and people turn on their televisions and they see suitcases and arms falling from the sky into Donbass. The next day, it was easy. They were ready to go for sanctions. I think what's happened here is that people are horrified and shocked. They're turning on their televisions and they're watching cruise missiles go into Ukrainian apartment buildings. And that has created a permissive political environment that really is changing Europe's approach and Germany's approach to its geopolitical vocation.
Let me ask you, let's assume one scenario is that Putin does essentially decapitate the leadership of Ukraine and installs a leadership and a regime friendly to Russia, that he essentially succeeds in undermining Ukraine's independence. We can talk about the cost. We can talk about what that kind of means. But I wonder, can you give us some sense of what does the world look like? Relations between the United States and Russia, between Europe and Russia, in a world in which he's succeeded in his goal of essentially undermining Ukraine's independence. What does a new containment look like? Angela.
Well, yeah. So let me first start off by saying I think it's going to be very difficult for him to install a puppet government and have it survive, because the minute that the Russian troops, start withdrawing, that puppet government is gone. I mean, they're going to meet an insurgency in Ukraine anyway, which I think the West will support. So this will be very difficult for him to sustain. But, if they do succeed in subduing Ukraine and putting in a more pro-Russian government, I think that Russia or the Putin regime itself would still be treated by the West, not all of the world, as a pariah country, really, as we see now. I mean, the US and Europe are breaking so many of their ties with Russia and are going to continue to do so. But the rest of the world, China is, even though the Chinese do not approve of the war that's going on now, they're still supporting Russia. I mean, they've said they believe in Ukraine's territorial integrity, but they'll support Russia. The Indians, they abstained today in the United Nations vote, and they're not going to go against Russia. And there are a number of countries around the world that are not imposing sanctions on Russia. So we are in a world where the West will certainly see Russia as a major antagonist, but the rest of the world, or some of the rest of the world, will not see Russia as a major antagonist. And then I guess the big question is, at some point, if Russia succeeds in subduing Ukraine, and again, I'm very doubtful that they're going to be able to do that for any length of time, then I suppose there would be a push among some countries, maybe in Europe even, to return to a more, quote unquote, status quo ante or quote unquote normal situation where they do begin to engage with Russia again. I don't know how. And I think that's Putin's calculation, is that once this is over, if it is indeed over, and if Russia prevails, then Western divisions will emerge again, and people will go back to business as they did after the Russia-Georgia war, and as they did after 2014 in Crimea. Is it going to be different this time? And we really don't know. On the other hand, if Putin then, once he subdued Ukraine, and again, this RIA Novosti article that was taken down gives you some idea of what he wanted to do, which is to create a kind of federative, a new Slavic state, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And then what are his, where does he set his sights after that? And I think that would be, would then provoke a Western determination still to keep containing Russia and not engaging with it again.
Charlie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the foreseeable future, we're headed back to something that will resemble containment. It's not going to be, in my mind, quite as fragmented, a block here, a block there. They have nothing to do with each other because the world has changed. We have cyber issues, pandemic issues, global warming issues. We're sort of more interdependent than we used to be. But I think Russia will be a pariah state for the time being, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And I share Angela's view that it's hard to see this working out in a way that is stable. I too see a long-running insurgency and a regime in Kyiv, run by a Lukashenko lookalike who has no legitimacy and who cannot really control the country outside of what's controlled through coercion. I do think that even as we kind of prepare for a Cold War with Russia, or Cold War 2.0, it won't be long before we get back to thinking hard and long about China, because Russia still is a country with an economy the size of Texas. It has big fossil fuel reserves and nuclear weapons, but especially now that it is a pariah, it's not really going to kind of be a driver of 21st century geopolitical life. We put it in the box and we stare at it, but China is a full spectrum peer competitor, a first-class high-tech sector, a first-class scientific sector. It will soon have the world's largest economy. So I think we're going to have to deal with a Russia that we need to contain, even as we figure out how to live in a world in which the world's largest economy with a full service, full spectrum military, industrial, technological complex comes online.
Well, let me follow up. Is there, in your view, is there an off-ramp to this crisis that doesn't, and I don't want to go the route of saying what happens if Putin himself is undermined and his regime is undermined by the mistakes that he's made. We can talk about that. But I wonder if, short of the story of Putin essentially subduing Ukraine, decapitating its leadership, installing a puppet regime, I wonder, is there an off-ramp to this crisis that reduces, obviously, the violence, that creates a mechanism for Putin to retreat in some way without the fall of Ukraine? I'm just trying to look for, other than the kind of internal tensions within Russia leading to Putin's demise, is there another way you could think about this crisis resolving that doesn't either require a new Cold War in which Russia is isolated, or a hopeful Russia in which the forces below actually undermine Putin's own ability to run Russia in the future? Angela, any off-ramp?
Look, the Ukrainians and Russians held, ceasefire talks a couple of days ago on the Belarus-Ukrainian border. The Russian demands were, recognize that Crimea is part of Russia, demilitarize and, denazify. So they weren't even serious in those talks about just talking about a ceasefire. President Zelensky has hinted that he would be willing to talk about a permanently neutral state for Ukraine. So he's willing to negotiate. It doesn't look as if the Russians are interested in negotiation. The West, NATO and the US, we have offered a number of off-ramps to Russia. Yes, when we responded to Russia's ultimatums, we said, we're not going to say that NATO will never enlarge again, and we're not going to withdraw NATO to where it was in 1997. But let's talk about missile defense components that you find threatening. Let's talk about redoing the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, which the Trump administration pulled the US out of. Let's talk about confidence building measures, about troop deployments that you say you find threatening. In other words, we offered a lot of security related issues where we were willing to sit down with the Russians and make some compromises ourselves. I think it turns out that from the beginning, when we asked the question, was Putin seriously interested in negotiation, or did he just throw these treaties at us as an excuse to say, once we refuse to recognize his maximum demands, that this is then the reason to go in and invade Ukraine? And I'm afraid I think the latter is the answer to that. So I do not see the possibility for an off-ramp as long as he is in charge of this and seems to be just so intent on subduing Ukraine.
Charlie, what about you?
I would say that the most likely off-ramp, and it's not likely, would be some kind of political transition in Russia. Russia is not North Korea. It's not as if there's one person with his thumb on the system and anybody who pushes back gets a bullet in the head. Yes, he has a very loyal coterie of people around him, but it's not inconceivable to me that either within Putin's inner circle or somewhere in the system, there is a decision that this is not working. This is not helping. My assets, my money, everything I accumulated over the course of my life just got frozen. Again, I don't think it's likely. I'd be interested to hear what Angela has to say about this, but that would be my most likely scenario for a soft landing. And that's because it's hard for me to imagine that Putin is going to declare a ceasefire, that Zelensky would get on TV and say, you know what, I've thought about this and we're ready for neutrality. One, because he now has a seething population that wants nothing to do with neutrality. And number two, I think even if he did that, Putin is now too deep in. And I think he believes his rhetoric. He really does think that there's a neo-Nazi regime in Kiev of course, run by a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister, and that deep down inside, every Ukrainian is a wannabe Russian, and we just need to liberate the country. He may now understand that that was wrong, but I just don't see him putting his tanks into reverse and going home. So I really do worry, fear, and think it's likely that we're going to see the toppling of the Ukrainian government and a very ugly, messy, bloody occupation of at least Eastern Ukraine. I have doubts that he wants to go all the way to the Polish border. It's a big country. Western Ukraine is very Ukrainian and not Russian speaking. But I'm pretty concerned that yes, the first week of the war did not go particularly well, but Russia is going to turn up the heat.
Well, I'm going to continue the conversation by going to some of the questions which have been coming through on the Q&A, and if you have more, please put them in. And our staff are going through those questions. If you could please identify yourself, especially if you're an alum, when you graduated, and I will continue the conversation and the themes that we've been in with some of the questions. And I'm going to start because it's directly related to another kind of what next question, which is you talked a lot about what would happen in him subduing Ukraine. There is the scenario that you raised earlier, and Bernard Pichi asked about it from SFS 71, and a good friend of mine. What or who would succeed Putin if he is overthrown? So what is the scenario in which Putin does not sort of last? How secure is his position within Russia, and what would a post-Putin government look like, since there are not a lot of successors waiting in the wings? Let me throw that question to Angela.
Thank you. Well, this is a question a number of us have been pondering over. Putin has ensured that there's really no one around who could challenge him. I mean, that's obviously deliberate. He now has himself potentially in power constitutionally till 2036. We are hearing some rumors now in the media that it's possible, but not everyone in the Russian military agrees with this. A few weeks ago, a group of former army officers, generals, published an open letter criticizing Putin for the buildup around Ukraine and saying it would essentially be madness to invade Ukraine. And some people believe that even though these were kind of ex-officers, they were encouraged to do this by people who are currently in the military themselves. We don't know the details of it, but that's just one data point out there. And then we've been reading that the FBI apparently had some, data from someone suggesting that there were, people around Putin who are really questioning the wisdom of what he's doing, because, it's had tremendous or could have tremendous economic effects on Russia. It's personally all the people who've been sanctioned, and it's going to set Russia back for years, particularly the export controls. That will be imposed will really set back the sort of industrial base. Now, having said all that, it's not clear who could succeed him. Though, one of the people in his inner circle who doesn't come from the intelligence services, but does have some political experience is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. He used to be at one point the Minister of Emergency Situations. He is a popular politician. He's not an ethnic Russian, but he is a popular politician. And, some people think that this is someone who, were there to be sort of an orderly handover of power, could take over. But that's all, pure speculation. We have no idea whether this is in the cards or how this would happen. But there's no identifiable, obviously all the opposition leaders are either in jail or they've left the country.
Can I turn to another question on the impact of this crisis on Europe? And I want to go to Charlie on that. We've now heard that approximately almost 900,000 people have left Ukraine, and that seems to be just the start. Moving into Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania could grow beyond to over 1 million. What do you think the impact is going to be on the stability of Europe because of that level of migration, and how do you think that might impact the European home?
Well, it's an impressive response to a grave humanitarian crisis. And it's important to keep in mind the last crisis of this sort, which was black and white on the other side. That is to say, there were lots and lots of Syrians and other asylum seekers freezing to death on the border between Belarus and Poland. And the EU has backed Poland in keeping them out. We hear reports that the Greeks have been pushing asylum seekers back into the water in flimsy boats, and they're drowning. So up until last week, Europe's approach to the inflow of migrants was watertight, and there was a political consensus, even though it was an ugly political consensus. And now, given the shock to the system of Putin's invasion, they're opening their borders. There are tent cities coming up. People are literally opening their homes. I have many friends who have said, I now, have somebody living with me. I open my flat and there are Ukrainians sleeping on my floor. So this is really quite an outpouring of assistance that's impressive and important. My one caveat, Joel, and this would apply to us as well, let's not labor under the illusion that a Russian invasion of Ukraine solves the problems that existed in Europe and in the United States 1 week ago. I was relieved when I watched President Biden that he only spent about a quarter of the State of the Union on the war. And that's because most Americans are still much more concerned about healthcare and wages and bridges and tunnels than they are about the fall of Kyiv. And in Europe, a liberal populism is still alive and well, and it may well grow because of the influx of so many Poles. Keep in mind that in France, the anti-immigrant sentiment has stemmed principally from the influx of North Africans and other Muslims. But in the UK, the big problem was Poles, not Muslims. In other parts of Europe, the problem is East Europeans and Ukrainians. It's not immigrants from North Africa. So this problem is right now is sort of being pushed underneath by geopolitical exigency. But we do have an important election looming in France. The far right in Germany has been piggybacking on the anti-COVID restriction world, so they're growing. We can't assume that this is a war that puts Humpty Dumpty back on the wall. All the problems that we had a week ago are still with us and need to be addressed. We need to get our own houses in order.
Well, let me go back to the Putin and Putin's understanding of the situation and his ability or his willingness to undertake risks. Edwin Farrell of SFS 91 asked, how do you really evaluate the implicit, I would say explicit threat to use nuclear weapons? And there have been several other questions about this notion. Do we really think that Putin is prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons and elevate the conflict to that level? Angela.
So, for the past few years, I've noticed that, Russian colleagues of mine, people, scholars writing about all this, and some of the officials have talked about the possibility of a limited nuclear war. This has been, it's been circulating there for some time. And obviously, when one reads things like that or talks to people, you think, well, this is all very theoretical. Again, until recently, I think one would have thought that Putin is a rational actor. He's not a huge risk taker, and he wouldn't actually think about using nuclear weapons. But there are people who believe that if things get worse from the Russian point of view, and they're not winning the way they want to in Ukraine, and there's a lot of Western support for Ukraine, that they could somehow fire a tactical nuclear weapon, maybe over the Black Sea or somewhere where it wouldn't maybe directly hit civilians, but obviously there would be radiation as a demonstration effect to get NATO and the West to back off from supporting Ukraine. Now, hopefully that's highly unlikely, but I think at this point in the conflict, we can't completely rule it out just because Putin has been talking about it. Last week, again, in one of those speeches, he said, you know, you should really stop supporting Ukraine, because if you continue doing this and provoking us, we will take measures, you know, that you never thought you would see, you know, thinly veiled hints. And he likes to go around saying, you know, we're a nuclear superpower. Obviously, we all know that Russia is a nuclear superpower. So I think at this point, with so many unknowns, you cannot rule out the possible use of a tactical nuclear weapon.
Can I ask and stay with Angela, because it's an important point about Russian domestic politics. Bob Bengston, SFS 97, asks about the domestic pushback in Russia, given the fact that you're sort of saying that there is a real tangible risk of Putin elevating this further. And of course, we have the sanctions and economic hardships. Are the media overblowing reports that those things might have an impact on domestic opinion in a way that would actually alter Putin's calculus, or is that wishful thinking on the part of the West?
Well, I think we can certainly say that for some reason, it's hard to imagine why the Kremlin did not prepare the Russian population for this war. If you were watching state media, they talked about the United States and NATO provoking Russia, but the idea that there would be a full-scale invasion wasn't ever really publicly said. And we know now from social media videos of Russian POWs, a lot of these young conscripts did not realize they were being sent to invade Ukraine. They thought they were going on, you know, some war games, some maneuvers, and some of them, in fact, have then surrendered. And so that's by way of saying, when the body bags start coming back, and the mothers and fathers see their sons, you know, killed in a conflict with a nation that Putin just told them was a brother nation to them, there surely will be a lot of unhappiness about that. The question is how it can be translated into any kind of effective political pressure. We've seen thousands of mainly urban educated Russians out on the streets in 50 cities across Russia protesting the war. I think 6,000 people by now have been arrested and are sitting in jail. We've seen journalists, cultural figures, and some business people also come out against the war and say there have to be peace negotiations. So there's clearly opposition. They shut down yesterday the one remaining independent radio station in Russia, Echo Moskvy, the Echo of Moscow, that's been in operation since the Soviet collapse. And they shut down the one remaining independent TV station. And those people have left Russia because they now fear for their lives. So there's much greater repression, but there is also resistance to this. Apparently today, the European Union has said it's considering special asylum procedures, not only for Ukrainians, but for Russians who oppose this. Whether this can translate into pressure on Putin, either to change his policies or somehow that he will no longer be the leader, it's very hard to say, because you still have a government run by people from the intelligence services who at least appear to be pretty much in control.
Thanks. And I'm going to go to Charlie now. You mentioned China earlier. A parent, Tijana Susu, a parent of a 20 student who's graduating in 22, asked about China and India. I mean, given what Angela was talking about, the possibility of further escalation, the imbalance and unstable leadership that we're seeing in Russia, do you think that countries like China and India will ultimately want to appease the West or engage with the West as it gets more unstable? Or do you think they're going to fundamentally try to take maximum advantage of the situation and push against America's perhaps unipolar effort to oversee a new global order?
I mean, I would distinguish between India and China in the sense that, you know, I think it's unfortunate that India has abstained both in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. After all, they're, you know, supposed to be a democracy and part of the new Indo-Pacific alliance to stand up to China and autocracy. But clearly, you know, there's a certain amount of geopolitical expedience going on here that has to do with generally good relations between Delhi and Moscow, and arms sales and trade and other linkages between the two countries. And I don't think that's going to change. I think the the Indians are going to sit on the fence and try to have their cake and eat it too. I don't think the Chinese are going to sit on the fence. I think the Chinese will continue their tilt to Russia, even in the scenario of a really ugly toppling of the regime and a long-running occupation. As I said earlier, I think one interesting question is secondary sanctions and whether we see the US and the Europe begin to scale back economic engagement with China as a response to their support for Russia and even efforts to help bail out Putin. I mean, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, right? We do know that Russia and China have talked about an alternative to SWIFT, that they have been developing a way of barter or non-dollar denominated exchanges. We know there's a second pipeline being built to connect Russia to China. And given China's longer term aspirations and the head of steam that it's built up to push back against the United States, I think we're looking at a Cold War 2.0 that isn't with a combined fixed bloc of Russia and China, but in which there is a kind of effective partnership between Russia and China that we're going to have to navigate.
Let me end with a last question about US and US leadership. Both of you served in senior roles in the US government. You've been thinking about US leadership and global affairs for a long time. On the one hand, both of you mentioned that the US has actually shown sort of surprising adeptness at bringing the allies together, at pushing for a unified response to this. But at the same time, both of you also mentioned the fact that, if anything, this shows is that the 40-year plus effort led by the US to try to bring, we used to call these transition economies, right? To bring a transition to market and to democratic institutions has clearly failed. And if you add to that the collapse of the efforts in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and in other countries, what does this say about the strength and power of U.S. leadership in this post-Cold War, post the collapse of Berlin? If this era changes, what does this mean for U.S. leadership? Let me start with Charlie, and then we'll end with Angela.
I think there are a couple of very significant changes that we need to keep in mind as we gaze forward. One is that we are living through a real consequential shift in the global distribution of power. And yes, if you add up the US and Europe and Japan and Australia and South Korea and Taiwan, you get a serious aggregate wealth and capability that outmatches what China or Russia or others can bring to the table. But there has been a shift away from unipolarity towards some kind of, hybrid bipolar, multipolar system. And that simply means that the United States, with its allies, won't enjoy the material or the ideological dominance that we once did. And it's worth keeping in mind that democracy worldwide is in recession, right? We had a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall in which there was a lot of democratization going on. Well, for the last decade or so, that's switched into reverse. And then the second big change here is the internal politics of the liberal world. I still am much more scared of what American politics will bring than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I say that because, if we get our political lights back on and the political center in the United States comes back to life, I'm pretty confident we'll be able to deal with Putin or whoever comes after Putin and with Xi. If this country remains deeply divided, deeply polarized, if we see a switch back to something that would resemble neo-isolationism, aversion to teamwork, America first going off on its own, then I worry that we're not going to get Russia right. We're not going to get China right. And so it's the combination of the two, the shift to a more dispersed distribution of power, and that the liberal anchor itself is not as healthy and as liberal as it was during the days of the Cold War. And yeah, we had a lot of bipartisanship and centrism and ideological moderation during the Cold War, caused in part by the Soviet threat. But it also had a lot to do with domestic factors, which is why, as I said earlier, I think we need to make sure that even as we stand up to Russia, we don't slip back and get distracted and not do our homework right here in the United States.
Okay, a last word to Angela on this. U.S. leadership in the Cold War.
Right. I don't have too much to add to what Charlie said. I mean, we were able to prevail during the Cold War because we were much more united as a country and in believing in, democratic ideals. Of course, we had the Vietnam War, we had a number of other things, and we had some internal turmoil, but essentially we believed in our system, and we believed that we were going to be able to combat, the Soviet bloc and the communist system. We don't have those beliefs anymore. We really need to focus on our own deep domestic divisions. We're really not a very good beacon example of democracy to the rest of the world. I think, in this particular crisis, the Biden administration has done a good job, again, of rallying the allies and going back, particularly with the Europeans and the shock of this invasion, to the ideals that we believe in. But those ideals, as we can see in our own country, are not shared by everyone. So I think it will be a struggle going forward. As Charlie said, democracy is in retreat. Russia and China would like to make the world safe for authoritarians. Russia may now not be able to play the role that it once did because of what it's done in Ukraine. But I think we should go back to basics and focusing on trying to heal some of the very deep divisions in our country and the lack of belief that many Americans have, in our system and in the government itself.
Well, look, I want to thank you both. We often say to students who are thinking about coming to SFS, the reason why they come is because they get a front row seat to history. They couldn't have a more consequential set of events to engage with, to understand, to analyze, and to think innovatively about than what we've sort of seen, what they've seen in the last just couple of years of their student lives. And we wanted to give you a sense, the SFS alumni who've attended today, we want to give you a sense of that front row seat to history as well by bringing in some of our best faculty members to talk about one of the most consequential issues that we've certainly seen in the last generation. So I thank you all for returning to SFS, going back into the classroom. Let me thank Professors Angela Stent and Charlie Kupchan for their thoughtful comments and for their leadership in helping us understand this, both within our school, but as you've seen them, I'm sure, in so many other media outlets, helping America grapple with this extraordinary challenge. Thank you all for participating. Thank you both for being with us. And I hope to engage and continue to engage with our SFS alumni community as we continue to see the cataclysmic events that come out of this remarkable change. Thank you very much. I wish you all.
Thank you for hosting, Joel.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.